Am I awake? Am I prepared? Are you listening to my prayer? Can you hear my voice? Can you understand? Am I awake? Am I prepared? Ya la 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 la, 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 ya la 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 la. Am I awake? Am I prepared? Are you listening to my prayer? Can you hear my voice? Can you understand? Am I awake? Am I prepared? Ya la 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 la, 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 ya la 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 la. Barechu et Adonai HaMevorach. Baruch Adonai HaMevorach Le'olam va'ed, Le'olam va'ed. Ya la 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 la, 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 ya la 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 la.
הנה מה טוב ומה נעים שברחים גם יחד. 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 How good it is, how sweet it is to be together on this day. How good it is, how sweet it is to be together on this day. הנה מה טוב ומה נעים שברחים גם יחד. הנה מה טוב ומה נעים שברחים גם יחד. שלום עליכם, סלאם עליכום. שלום עליכם, סלאם עליכום. שלום עליכם, סלאם עליכום. שלום עליכם, סלאם עליכום. How good it is, how sweet it is to be together on this day. How good it is, how sweet it is to be together on this day. הנה מה טוב ומה נעים שברחים גם יחד. הנה מה טוב
many of you on the live stream. So welcome to Temple Israel this evening. On this beautiful spring evening, we're thrilled to have my personal friend, Joseph Browdy, here with us. Joseph and I became friends well over a decade ago, 15, maybe even 20 years ago in New York City, through friends. And I have always admired Joseph's scholarship, both of the Jewish world and of the Arab, Muslim, Middle East world. And Joseph, I will say, broadly has a particular interest and skill and expertise in sharing untold stories of the Middle East. We receive a particular narrative often through media outlets and sources, both in the general public and state-run media, of course, in the Middle East. But what's happening among the lives of those in the region is actually, as we know, far more complex. It's just that they don't necessarily have the platforms or the ability to tell their own story. So this is going to be an evening in which first Joseph will introduce himself and share a bit about his work, and then we'll share a number of clips in which he and his organization have enabled folks in the Middle East, especially in Gaza, to share a bit of their own story with the intention of giving all of us, the rest of the outside world, a much more full and nuanced vision of what their lives are like and what they believe and what they think and believe. By way of a formal introduction, Joseph Browdy is the founder and president, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but of the Center for Peace Communications. And he's an expert in Near Eastern languages and history, fluent in many of the languages of the Middle East. And over the past 20 years, he has lived and worked in North Africa, the Levant, the Gulf states, Iran. He has written several books about the Arab-Israeli partnership, about law enforcement in Morocco, about the history of Iraq, about a number of different issues. He's written articles that have been published all across the journalistic spectrum, hosts podcasts both in English and in Arabic, and he'll tell you even more. But that's just a bit of a biography of our distinguished guest this evening. Please welcome Joseph Browdy.
Thank you very much.
And I will add that we are always thrilled to partner with my friend and our congregational partner, Rabbi Jeremy Wiederhorn and TCS here in Westport. So once again, thank you for this partnership.
Michael, Jeremy, thank you both, and thank you for coming. It's obviously a pleasure to be here on a beautiful day in Westport. You suggested that I tell you a little bit about myself and some context about what we're going to see. So by way of introduction, I'm an American-born Jew of mixed roots, an Iraqi mother who fled Iraq with 150,000 Jews in 1950 to Jerusalem, and an Ashkenazi father. And so a sense of identification with multiple cultures is something I grew up with, as well as a love for Israel, an affinity for Arab peoples, and a lifelong enthusiasm for the cause of bringing them all together. Obviously, the past few years have seen some dramatic improvements and potential through the Abraham Accords. The book that you mentioned is called Reclamation, A Cultural Policy for Arab-Israeli Partnership, which was published by the Washington Institute in 2019, about a year before the Abraham Accords. And what it did was to herald what seemed like an imminent development, where not only would Israel and a number of Arab countries come together, but there would also be an opportunity through those new partnerships to roll back generations of demonization of Israel and Jews. For me and for the organization I founded, That book was sort of a cookbook and kind of a manifesto upon which the Center for Peace Communications was created. It's a lifelong cause to find ways to challenge generations of brainwashing in the region that stand not only in the way of Arab-Israeli peace, but also in the way of civil society in the Arab world. Now, it's been a little bit more difficult to be optimistic about prospects lately in the region amid the conflagration in Gaza and rockets and tragedy, as well as the new trend of détente between Saudi Arabia and Iran, reconciliation between many Arab countries and the Assad regime. And yet, one of the greatest grounds for hope, which people don't talk about all that much, is the fact that, of all places, in the countries that Iran dominates most, in Iraq, in Syria, in Yemen, and elsewhere, people want something different. They know the tragedy, the poverty, and the civil strife that is caused by Iran's vision of the region. And they are interested in the emerging Abrahamic axis, this group of countries that have come together through the Abraham Accords. And many, many people in those countries want to leave the so-called axis of resistance and join the Abrahamic peace. The problem is that one rarely hears from them because they're not allowed to open their mouths publicly. And so a false veneer of rejectionism is portrayed by the media in those countries. What our organization sought to do was to lend a platform to these brave voices to make their case, both against Iran and in favor of peace. One of the efforts that we waged in that category, and perhaps the boldest of them thus far, was a conference that we convened in Iraq, where we brought 312 Iraqis from across the country to a conference room to publicly call for normalization with Israel in open defiance of Iranian militias. And I wanted to share a few minutes from one of those speeches because it gives you a sense of the stakes and also the void that these voices can fill.
أيها الحضور الكريم، لقد طال مخاض السنين والأيام الحزينة تندبكم باتخاذ الموقف. نحن مع وما زلنا وسنبقى مع ضحايا الهولوكوست ومع ضحايا 11 من سبتمبر ومع ضحايا نيس ومع ضحايا سبايكر ومع ضحايا الكرادة ومع الضحايا في كل بقعة من بقاع الأرض. ومن موقفنا هذا في رفض الإرهاب بكل أشكاله ورفض العنف بكل صوره ورفض سياسة الإقصاء والتهميش على أساس عرقي أو ديني، نمد أيدينا للسلام لكل دول العالم، وسيكون السلام مشروعنا العظيم والأول في سياستنا مع العالم. أيها الحضور الكريم، لقد جعلتنا جائحة كورونا المقيتة نقف في مفترق طرق بعد أن هددت البشرية بالبقاء أو الفناء. نقف اليوم على عتبة من عتبات التاريخ يحكمنا ضميرنا ومبدأ العدالة داخلنا باتخاذ الطريق السليم في تصويب الأمور وإعطاء كل ذي حق حقه. إن إسرائيل اليوم وكما تعلمون دولة قوية وجزء لا يتجزأ من العالم والأمم المتحدة. لن يهمل العراق هذه الحقيقة ولن يعيش في عزلة عن العالم. كان العراق مهد الحضارات ومهد البشرية وسيبقى قلب العالم النابض، وكونه كذلك فلا بد للعراق اليوم من تغيير سياسته، وبات أمرا ضروري ولا بد منه للسلام في المنطقة الاعتراف بإسرائيل كدولة صديقة، خصوصا وإن ما يقارب النصف مليون إسرائيلي هم من أصول عراقية، عيونهم كانت ولا زالت شاخصة نحو العراق. تترقب عين الأم متى تحنو على الأولاد. لا زالوا هؤلاء ينتظرون لحظة الاعتراف بإسرائيل كدولة لهم ولإخوانهم الذين يشاركونهم بلدهم، فضلاً عن أن الحقيقة التاريخية الواضحة للجميع كوضوح الشمس أن جميع اليهود في العالم أصلهم وجذرهم العراق. والعراق لن يتخلى عن الجميع، لن يتخلى عن الإسرائيلي كما لن يتخلى عن الشعب الفلسطيني. أيها الحضور الكريم، هكذا نظرت دولة الإمارات العربية المتحدة الشقيقة إلى مستقبل الأجيال ومصالح الشعوب، ودخلت في اتفاقيات إبراهيم للسلام. ولنا وإننا كما دولة الإمارات ندرك مدى أهمية الشراكة مع إسرائيل على كافة الأصعدة. لقد طال زمن المجاملات الفارغة والجوفاء، والجلوس بصمت أصبح مرفوضاً وغير مقبول. أيها الحضور الكريم، أيتها الوجوه المنيرة، إن مستقبل الأطفال في العراق وفي إسرائيل وفي كل مكان في رقابنا. نحن المسؤولون عن السلام، سنحمل بأيدينا زهوراً نعطيها مع قبلة على خد طفل، ولن نقبل بأن يشهر السلاح بوجهه البريء. نحن الرائدون لمشروع السلام في العراق ونواته الأولى. نريد السلام مع أنفسنا، ونريد السلام مع إسرائيل، نريد السلام مع كل دول العالم. سيكون السلام منهجنا، وسنلبس رداء الفرح بعد أن بكينا، وستباركنا البيوت التي فيها تربينا، وستفتخر بنا الأرض التي عليها خلقنا. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
I wanted to share that with you by a speech by a very brave woman and a single mom with 5 children who dared to stand up and say that in Iraq because it shows in an Arab idiom the aspiration for peace with Israel that is shared by as many as 55% of Iraqis, according to some polls. If there were a referendum on the issue, peace with Israel would win. When you think about that speech and what it implies, it actually sends some very important messages to multiple audiences. And it's significant that it was covered in 21 Arab countries and all over the world, from the US, from the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, US and Canada to China and Japan. On the one hand, it breaks a taboo in Arab countries where talk of normalization has been forbidden, literally against the law. At the same time, in those countries that have dared to make peace with Israel and are themselves being vilified by some very powerful media and demagogues in the region, this sends them a message of encouragement. It emboldens them. Not only have you made the right choice, but there are many, many people in the darkest corners of the region who want to follow your lead. And finally, in the West, this is a very powerful repudiation of BDS and the larger movement to delegitimize Israel, because what it says is that at a time when a rising tide of Arabs across the region want to move forward toward integration between Israel and Arab states, BDS wants to isolate Israel and take the region backward toward segregation, in a sense. And so it's that exposure of BDS as a foreign contrivance, recklessly disinterested in the will of Arab publics, that is one of the reasons why we not only do these things, but also amplify their voices in the West. But of course, this comes at a price, because no sooner had we made considerable waves in the region than Iran and its proxies declared war on the conference. And we had to successfully protect all 312 participants. We had a strategy to do so. It worked. Everyone is fine. Not everyone remains in Iraq today. But there is a price to be paid for people who take this bold stand. So not only are we concerned to elevate these voices, we're also constantly thinking about ways to do so as safely and powerfully as possible. Part of the way we do that is by lobbying for laws to protect these people. And President Biden signed a law to that effect at the beginnings of protection for Arab peacemakers last year. But part of it is figuring out ways to create new types of events, not necessarily a physical convocation, but something else that could be no less impactful. And it was with that history in mind that we approached the subject of Gaza. Gaza has something in common with Iraq. It is also a place where the majority of the population is profoundly at odds with the militia that rules them, meaning Hamas. Many opinion polls indicate that most Gazans are against rocket attacks on Israel, not necessarily out of love for Israel, but because they don't want the destruction that those rocket attacks invite. They are, in many cases, in favor of a two-state solution. They want an altogether different future, but they are forbidden to speak out. So what we did was to devise a way that they could communicate on the international stage. We organized to interview dozens of Gazans inside the Strip today on the condition that we wouldn't reveal their names and their voices. We then proceeded to take their riveting testimony and bring together a team of animators, artists, and musicians to create video animation based on the stories that they told. We then subtitled the animation into 7 languages, and we signed agreements with everyone from Al Arabiya, the big Saudi news outlet, to the Times of Israel and Latin American and Iranian channels to broadcast this material. It turned out to have a profound effect in the region, which I will describe later, but first I'd like to share with you some of these voices. The first bit of testimony sort of takes you quite intimately into a world outside the headlines, but the world that Gazans really experience and struggle through.
أخوي عمره تقريبا 33 سنة. أمي كانت تزرع له ملوخية، تزرع له فجل وهو يبيع، يعني كان مصدر إنه دخل إلنا. كان بيبسط يعني بأي بسطة مثلا بياخد له جهة وبيبسط عليها. الوقت إذا إجت الحكومة الشرطة هاي إجوا بيسحبوها منه. فمرة من المرات مسكوه وأخذوه. فبحكي لك لازم يفتح محل هو عنا، يعني هو يعني بده يشحد ويتداين ويتبهدل ويسرق عشان يرضيهم. ما كانش، ما قدرش، يعني قاعد يمكن 2 سنين فيه، هو بس بتلاحق هو وغيره من البيع وبيشتروا هدول. مرة اتهموه باتهام انه تثبت عليه تهمة مثلا مخدرات او انه حشيش، وهو ما بيعملش الحاجات هذه عشان يضل في السجن. انضرب على اساس انه يعني يعترف في اعترافات ملوش فيها، وقالوا له بنكري لك، بضلك محبوس هنا وبنكري وبتموت هنا. يعني هدول ما لهمش ملة بالعربي. فقرر انه يسافر، يعني يسيب البلد.
وين قرري هذه؟
راح على والله شاف الموت. يعني هو احنا اول حاجة ما كناش نعرف اي حاجة عنه. اتعرض لمع ناس حرامية، يعني في ناس زي مافيات، شغل مافيات. يعني لقى شباب من غزة كمان كان معاهم، كان معهم شاب هذا انقتل. وحاليا بصراحة بنعرفش اشي كتير. زمان كتير شهور ما كلمنا. يعني أمي دائما بتدعي له، أمي دائما بتعيط له إنه تسمع أخبار عنه. عن جد يعني مش على أخويا أنا بحكي، على كل كثير الشباب اللي زيه زي أخويا. يعني أخويا لقيت راح بس ما بنعرف شيء عنه. خلص يعني اللي بيطلع مننا مستحيل يرجع، يعني اللي زيه بيرجعش.
The series Whispered in Gaza is a series of 25 clips like that. 5 million people watched it on our platforms, and several million others watched it through our partners' platforms. The one you just saw went viral in the Arab world. I think it did because it exposes Hamas as not the heroes that many Arabs were raised to think they are, but rather enforcers of a very common sort of police state, the same sort of corruption and brutality that Arabs everywhere experience. Now, an example of a clip that I think had an important message for the West to hear is this next one, in which someone describes the human experience of something more familiar to outsiders about Hamas.
ملكيتك الفكرية منتهكة لما تطلع على الشارع تلاقي الحيطان صور القيادات، شعاراتهم، صورهم، قصصهم، ويعني تحس انك انت في منطقة حرب. انت عايش في سكنة عسكرية ولا عايش في مدينة؟ غزة مدينة، فلماذا تخترق حتى حوائط غزة، لافتات غزة، رائحة غزة؟ تمام؟ تسيء بالجو العام. المدينة غير الحضارية، غير الإنسانية، غير المدنية. في أي لحظة يبدأ القصف عليها، صواريخ طالعة، صواريخ نازلة، اضرب رد وهكذا، مهيئين هيك، مما أدى إلى انهزام داخلي وخراب نفسي عظيم. المواطن الفلسطيني في غزة غير سوي نفسيا. إنك تحكي أنا مستعد للموت ومستعد للشهادة، هذه الانهزامية وفقدان قيمة الحياة هذا مؤشر خطير بيحكي إنه الناس هذه ماتوا. فمن منطلق إنساني لابد من حل إنساني فقط. يعني أوكي، فلسطين قضيتنا وفلسطين قضية عادلة، لكن هذا لا يعني أن تقتل الشعب الفلسطيني مرارا وتكرارا بدون أي نتيجة. أنا مالي، أنا كإنسان قاعد في داري أنقصف ليش؟ يمكن أنا بدي أقاوم إسرائيل بعود، أنا عندي عود بعزف موسيقى، ممكن أنا بدي أعمل لحن وأقاومهم، أنا حر. يعني أنت ما بتفرض علي أسلوب المقاومة.
Now that got a lot of attention right here in the United States, particularly with people who are listening to the BDS movement and its calls, among other things, for armed struggle, cheering on Hamas calls to wage war on Israel. This is a very credible and authentic statement by someone who clearly has some problems with Israel and wants to protest its policies, but feels that the Hamas policy of violence and rocket attacks is self-destructive. And so we were very glad that it got quite a bit of attention in Western capitals, where a growing number of anti-Israel activists are trying to sort of advance the notion that Hamas and the people of Gaza are one. Another theme that came across throughout the interviews we did was the Gazan experience of Hamas as an occupying force. The story I'm about to show you captures, I think, what they mean when they say that, and also gives some insight into why these kinds of stories are rarely heard outside of Gaza.
طلعت المشكلة معمولة علشان واحد من متلازمة داون. بدت القصة إنه شركة الكهرب معها جيب من الشرطة خوفاً من إنه يصير بينهم وبين الناس اللي رايحين يفصلوا عنهم مشاجرة أو عراك. عارفين اللي رايحين يعملوه بيعمل مشاكل. وكفلهم اللي هو الشاب من متلازمة داون هو ابن عمي بكون. المهم اتهجموا عليه 4 من عناصر الشرطة. اتهجموا على أولاد عمي. أولاد عمي تراجعوا على البيت. بعد هيك عملوا استدعاء تقريبا ل4 دوريات شرطة. ضربوا النسوان والأطفال. أي حدا كانوا يلاقوه في وجهه كانوا يضربوه، وغير الرصاص الحي اللي انطخ على البيت بشكل مباشر. المهم صرنا أصلا نحاول نبعدهم عن البيت بالإحجار، إحنا وكل أولاد الحارة. بتحكي عن منطقة كاملة صارت تلحق الشرطة بالإحجار لحد ما انسحبوا. بنعيد تقريبا نفس الأحداث اللي صارت في الانتفاضة، بس مش مقاومة ضد اللي هو احتلال، لا، ناس يبعدوا الشرطة اللي المفروض تحميهم بالحجار. فأنا أيامي صورت نسوان عمام اللي هو اتضرروا من الموضوع. صورت اللي هو ابن عمي هذا لازم الداون. فتحت برنامج المونتاج وشرحت القصة كلها خلال الفيديوهات ونزلته على النت. بعد كم من ساعة بطلع في جوالي 7000 مكالمة. صاروا المخاتير تبعونا ينضغط عليهم من اللي هو قيادات تبعون حماس، ناشر فيديو خليه يحتفوا. يوم يومين 3 ضليتني مطارد خلال الفترة هذه، وهم بدوروا علي أو بفتشوا علي بحاولوا يمسكوني. أنا مش جاي أسوق عليك اللي هو دور البطولة أو شيء زي هيك. أنا يعني واحد من آلاف الناس اللي دائما بيتعرضوا لمواقف مشابهة زي هذه، ممكن مواقف تكون أصعب من مواقف. أول مرة أنا أفوت على سجن مش مكاني، هذا مش هذا المكان اللي أنا بنتمي له. في الوقت الحالي كل الشرفاء في المكان هذا، كل الناس اللي حاولت تشغل مخها في المكان هذا.
I think that kind of testimony puts in stark relief, why don't I put it this way, it presents a challenge to those who justify or defend Hamas and the violence that it presides over. It is to choose between supporting Hamas or supporting the Palestinians who are living under its rule. What does it mean to be pro-Palestinian in a situation like this? Surely it is not to support the people who are oppressing this young man and the many others like him. Now, these isolated stories also sort of reflect a larger critique that is shared by many Gazans about the people who govern them. And we found one young man who really kind of captured the argument pretty well.
هم دخلوا علينا ب 2007 بكلمة إصلاح والتغيير. هم دخلوا علينا بالإصلاح والتغيير هم في النهب، بالسرقة، بالذل، بالمهانة، بالواسطة، بقلة فلوس، بانعدام فلوس العمل. إيش ضل تعمل الحكومة عشان تنهك وتتعب وتنهب الشعب أكتر من هيك؟ إحنا بطلنا عارفين. مفيش أي مشروع صغير حتى لو كشك دخان أو مشاريب ساخنة أو باردة إلا وحاطة إيدها فيه، إلا بدها تاخد منه. حتى على الكورنيش مثلا في غزة كتير فتح كافيهات ومطاعم، لكن بالمقابل تاخد منهم ضرائب كبيرة جدا. فأنت لما تروح هناك حتى المكان اللي كان مجاني، المكان البحر، نروح نقعد نشرب قهوة. القهوة كانت مثلا بشيكل، هلقيت صارت لما بتروحي بتلاقيش مكان مجاني، لازم تقعدين في كافيه أو في مطعم. صارت لقيت القهوة ب3 شيكل وأكتر. صار الإشي بغلوه عليه على صاحب الكافيه صاحب المطعم، وبيغلى علينا إحنا. يعني بيتاجروا فينا باسم حاجة المقاومة. إحنا كنا زمان أيام الانتفاضة الأولى والانتفاضة الثانية كنا نقاوم، كنا نآمن في حاجة اسمها مقاومة، إنه بدنا نطرد المحتل. كان يقول مقاومة خالص بنسكت بدنا نحرر بلدنا، بدنا نحرر دولتنا. لكن لقيت حتى الشعب بطل يآمن في المقاومة، لقيت المقاومة صارت تجارة. موضوع الحروب اللي صارت في غزة من 2008 و2012 و2014 و2020 هذه كلها ربح، اللي بياكلها بس الشعب، الناس اللي بنضربوا الشعب، اللي بيتأذوا بس الشعب. كل ما صار حرب، كل ما دخلت مساعدات أكثر، كل ما هم استفادوا أكثر وإحنا لما بنستفيد أي حاجة. هم بكونوا في يعني محصنين في المخابئ تاعتهم، إحنا اللي بناكلها إحنا الشعب. وفي الآخر بقول لك إيش انتصار؟ وين الانتصار لما معظم أبراج غزة نزلت؟ طب وين الانتصار لما كثير ناس فقدوا فرص العمل تاعتهم؟ وين الانتصار لما معظم أو قول ثلث شعب غزة راحوا بيوتهم؟ وين الانتصار؟ وإحنا حاليا عايشين من قتل الموت يعني.
Now, some may wonder, given the reality and the suffering and the anger that is growing within Gaza toward Hamas, what are these people going to do about it? Or are they attempting to do something about it? And the answer is that they already have. There have been a number of street demonstrations against Hamas in Gaza that have gotten very little attention in the world media. Most recently in 2019, 1,000 young people, that's a lot of people in the Gaza Strip, took to the streets and protested Hamas and braved gunfire and prison. Naturally, we wanted to hear from some of the people who had participated in those demonstrations. And one of them speaks here.
قبل 3 سنوات احنا طلعنا بحراك بدنا نعيش، كان شعار نطالب فيه بحياة كريمة زي باقي الشعوب التانية. الشعب أراد أن يسمع صوته للمسؤول، ولكن زي ما شفتوا أكيد حماس قابلتنا بعكس ما تمنينا. قوبلنا بالاعتقال والمطاردة وفخاخ الرصاص، قوبل الحراك بكل ما هو بشع. عائلتي أخوتي اضطردوا وإلي أخ انسجن، وطبعا أجوا على بيتنا اقتحموه وكسروه، وبيوت كثير اقتحموها وكسروها بكل همجية. تهم إنه أنت بدك تعيش، تهمتك إنك بدك تتمرد على حماس، تهمتك إنك تابع لأجندات خارجية، تهمتك إنك عميل. الحكي في غزة والتعبير عن الرأي ممنوع، بس إحنا كشباب بنحاول نتمرد، نحكي، نكتب رغم التهديد اللي بيجينا، وإذا كتبت راح تنسجن. بس بنحاول نعلي صوتنا، نسمع صوتنا للبرا، ولكن هم أقوى منا. كل سنة بنحكي خلاص الشعب راح ينفجر، راح يطلع عليهم، ولكن السنة بتروح والشعب ساكت. بس قريبا يعني الشعب حينفجر عليهم، لأنه حماس على ما يبدو أنها ضعيفة حاليا.
كيف حاسة إنه في ضعف عندهم؟
كل ما ضربوا الناس أكتر كل ما كانت حماس ضعيفة، يعني خايفة من الشعب، بدها تحكمه بالقوة بالضرب. كل ما خافت وضعفت بتحكم الشعب أكتر، بتقسى عليه أكتر، بتظلمه أكتر.
Now, I said earlier that the nature of many of these clips poses a challenge to those who justify or defend Hamas to choose between supporting Hamas or supporting the Palestinians Hamas oppresses. These signs of bravery and a desire for something different, a willingness to take a bold stand in favor of change, I think pose a challenge of a different kind to Israel's supporters. It is a challenge to recognize that there are a whole lot of people in Gaza who want a different future and ask what can be done to empower them. Because surely, unless you want to think about retaking the Strip, and no one, certainly in the security establishment, thinks that's a good idea, a real paradigm shift in Gaza inevitably involves the mobilization of Gazans opposed to Hamas. And so the question of how to empower these types of people is one that matters a lot with respect to Israel's own security in the long run. Now, as to what they envision or what they want and how they feel about Israel itself, we heard from quite a few who shared their feelings about that. And I had one more clip from the series that I wanted to show you, and I thought it was poignant with respect to her own view about what to do with respect to Gaza's Jewish neighbors.
في صورة نمطية مغلوطة وخاطئة عن الشعب الفلسطيني في غزة، أنه هو شعب يحب الصواريخ، يحب الحروب. الناس هنا في غزة لا تحب الحروب. الحروب اللي بتصير في غزة هي قرارات من حكومة حماس ولأهداف سياسية تعنيها، تمام؟ قد تكون حماس مثلا عندها عجز في ميزانيتها المالية، فبتضطر تصنع حرب علشان تتدخل دولة قطر، وقطر ترسل الفلوس لحماس وبالتالي يوقف الحرب. فإحنا هنا ما بدنا حروب، بدنا نلاقي حياتنا، نبحث عن حياة تشبهنا مثلنا، لأنه إحنا عم نخاطر بصحتنا العقلية والنفسية والجسدية لأجل وضع ما اخترناه. إحنا الجيل الجديد مغيب مضلل من قبل الإعلام، بخلق جواتهم عطش تجاه الدم. تلاقي أبناء غزة مثلا مجرد ما يشوفوا يهودي مستعد يفقد حياته بس لأجل إنه يفرغ هذا الشعور اللي جواته إنه هذا قدامي عدوي، تمام؟ هو مش فاهم ولا شيء. وأصلا فكرة أن تستخدم السلاح للتحرير هي خاطئة. هم عم بيستخدموا السلاح لأجل أهداف خاصة ومصالح أطراف أخرى. زمان كان الإنسان لحتى يناضل يحمل الحجر ويطلقه على الدبابة، تمام؟ ببساطة. ومتى كان يعمل هيك شيء؟ لما الدبابة تتعدى أو تتجاوز حدودها مع الفلسطيني. لكن حاليا الشعب هذا غير مناضل، في فئة بتناضل باسم الشعب الفلسطيني كله، ولكن مش كل الشعب الفلسطيني متفق مع هذه الفئة. أنا نضالي هو إني أنا أتواصل مع أناس فلسطينيين إسرائيليين، أفهمهم إنه أنا هنا إنسان في غزة، مش وحش، مش إرهابي، مش محبة للسلاح، لأنه بالنهاية السلاح لا يقدم ولا يؤخر شيء في أي قضية.
Now, this string of clips began, of course, with a woman standing up and making a very bold speech. But here are a number of people who are whispering, and that's the name of our series, Whispered in Gaza. And yet, their voices appear to have had an even greater and sustained impact than the thunderous convocation in Iraq. First of all, Hamas was significantly rattled. We know that of the 5 million people on our platforms who watched the clip, 750,000 of them were in Gaza. In other words, nearly a half of the population watched them. Hamas, of course, tried to torpedo this project by launching an organized bot attack on our distribution platforms. Fortunately, they didn't succeed. They then tried to sow confusion by creating their own pirated versions of these clips. The same animation, but they overdubbed Hamas propaganda onto the pictures. So in our version, the original, it's a woman railing against the Hamas education system, fearing that they're going to brainwash her children into becoming suicide bombers. The Hamas pirated version has her saying, I overcame my fear and I sent my children to the mosque, and now I'm proud that they are going to be martyrs. But those constituted copyright violations, and so it was possible to get Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter to take those videos down. Now, meanwhile, in the Arab world, where the largest audience for this series resides, with the United States and Canada being a close second, the material spawned a public outcry, which relates to our goal that I mentioned before, that is the subject of the book, about rolling back rejectionist influence, puncturing the rejectionist narrative. In fact, this series was an epiphany for millions of Arabs who had been raised to think of Hamas as heroes, as liberators, as patriots, when in fact they were learning that Gazans regard them in fact as occupiers, as an occupying force that is unwanted by the population. Now, one of the things that happened as a result of this outcry was that quite a few, it seems that hundreds or more viewers turned to clerics, Muslim clerics in their countries, and asked for a ruling as to whether Hamas is legitimate as an Islamic governing entity. And a number of prominent clerics in Iraq, as well as Pakistan, decided to respond by issuing a fatwa, a religious edict, declaring Hamas illegitimate and citing the material as the basis for their ruling. So the final clip I wanted to share, and then make a couple of remarks to try and tie all this together, is about that fatwa.
أصدر المجلس الإسلامي للفتوى والإرشاد فتوى دينية صريحة تدين حماس وتساند حقوق الفلسطينيين المنتهكة في غزة، وهي الفتوى الإسلامية الأولى من نوعها التي تدين حماس وتحملها المسؤولية بشكل مباشر عما يجري في غزة من انتهاكات وظلم. نصت الفتوى على تحريم الانضمام والدعاء لحماس وعدم جواز دعمها وتمويلها، وتحميل حماس المسؤولية الكاملة حكما بسبب أفعالها الفاسدة في غزة، وإعلان جماعة الإخوان المسلمين بجميع فروعها منظمة إرهابية مخالفة لتعاليم الإسلام الحنيف. الفتوى التي صدرت مؤخرا أعلنها 3 فقهاء معروفين من العراق وباكستان، على رأسهم آية الله الشيخ فاضل البديري والشيخ المفتي عبد الله ذبيان عن أهل السنة والجماعة في وسط، والسيد نزار شاه الباكستاني عن المجلس الصوفي العالمي.
رأينا الوضع الذي تتعرض له غزة تحت حكم حماس وما تفعله من فظائع نراها بحق الفلسطينيين الآمنين العزل الذين لا حول لهم ولا قوة، فرأينا أنه من الواجب الشرعي نصرة المظلومين. فمن الحكم التي في ديننا تقول أنه كونوا للظالم خصما وللمظلوم عونا. من هذا المنطلق صدرت هذه الفتوى بحق حماس.
يؤكد المرجع الديني آية الله البديري أن الإساءة للشعب الفلسطيني لا يستثنى منها أحد، حتى من يعتقد بأنه قيادة تمثل الفلسطينيين.
نحن كمرجعية دينية نقف مع الشعب الفلسطيني المظلوم، ولا نقبل بأي إساءة إليه، لا من الجانب الإسرائيلي ولا من الجانب الفلسطيني، أعني بهم المتنفذين في السلطة، سواء أكان منظمة حماس أم غير منظمة حماس. وعلى هؤلاء المتنفذين وظيفتهم أن يحموا الشعب الفلسطيني.
الناطق باسم المجلس الإسلامي للإفتاء الشيخ محمد علي المقدسي، وهو عالم ومحاضر في الحوزة الدينية في النجف، أكد خلال لقائه مع صحيفة لوبس الفرنسية أنه من الدوافع لصدور هذه الفتوى كانت معاناة أهل غزة التي نقلتها سلسلة وشوشات من غزة الفيديوية.
طبعا ظهرت فيديوهات رآها كل العالم، المتابعين للشأن الفلسطيني الذي هو وشوشات من غزة. ظهر عدة من سكان غزة من نسائها ومن أطفالها ومن رجالها يذكرون ما يتعرضون له بسبب فساد حماس، وشهدوا أمام العالم بأنهم يتعرضون إلى الابتزاز وإلى التخويف، وهذه الشهادات لا بد لكل إنسان أن يأخذها بعين الاعتبار. زادت الشكوى من أفعال حماس بحق الشعب الفلسطيني الأعزل والفقير، فهذا أعطانا الدافع الأكبر وأعطانا الصورة الأوضح لإصدار فتوى بحق حماس.
هذه الفتوى لم تنطلق كموقف أو رأي ديني فقط، بل اتبعت نهجاً جديداً أكثر جرأة، حيث يطالب أصحابها دور الإفتاء والمؤسسات والقيادات الدينية في العالم الإسلامي إلى دعمها وإسنادها بناء على وثيقة الاستدلال وأحكام الشرع والفقه الإسلامي.
When we launched Whispered in Gaza, one of my mentors, Rob Satloff at the Washington Institute, said that the series had the potential to shake the foundations of Islamist rule in Gaza more than Israeli rockets and Egyptian border closures. And indeed, the advent of this fatwa, which was the first of its kind and a direct strike at the legitimacy of Hamas as an Islamic organization, perhaps represents the beginnings of the fulfillment of that prediction, although, of course, things take time. Now, what is all of this activity? When you think it may seem a little bit strange, right? An American organization that is organizing conferences in Iraq and sort of attempting to affect the public discussion in Arab countries. There aren't a lot of organizations like this today, but what we're doing is a very American approach to change. It's just American from another time. If you think back to the heyday of the Cold War, American civilians were playing a very important, very muscular role in attempting to roll back Soviet communism in Eastern Europe and elsewhere. Labor unions were working to empower, on the principle of solidarity with workers, to empower opponents of Soviet communism behind the Iron Curtain. Sometimes they worked with the US government, and sometimes they worked on their own. There were professors and student groups and publications that were trying to empower intellectuals opposed to Stalin. Civilian-led efforts overseas to promote change were a crucial part of that great period in American history and American foreign policy. It's important that these kinds of efforts be waged, including and especially by Americans, because of a disadvantage that Israel faces today in its aspiration to become a regional power. Yes, like Saudi Arabia and other countries, Israel has a very strong army, the strongest one. It has a very strong economy. But unlike other regional powers, its history of isolation from the region means that it has virtually no ground game when it comes to Arabic and Islamic politics and culture. It's a very basic thing, call it public diplomacy or public engagement, that a polity needs to cultivate, especially in a place like this. But Israel has a long way to go before it will be in a position to, in a serious and sustained way, engage these societies. So we as an organization are trying to demonstrate what is possible through concerted effort in this regard, and we'll obviously continue to do so. And along the way, we're delighted to share this kind of content because it is part of what we're trying to do, to really inform as many people as possible by platforming these voices. So thank you for your interest in these. And be glad to leave it to the rabbis to.
Thank you, Joseph. Really, fascinating and such, important work that you're doing, and really refreshing in many ways. It's not something, as you said, that we hear much about. In fact, it started just even in your biography. I'm so used to hearing the phrase Arab-Israeli conflict, and then as Rabbi Friedman was doing the bio, was reading the bio. I believe he said Arab-Israeli collaboration. I think was the CEO, and then it just kind of threw me even just because I wasn't even ready for it, and so just starting right there, obviously the conflict continues though, and this past week, we saw that there were more rockets coming, 900 plus rockets from Gaza, and then of course the Israeli retaliation. What can you tell us in terms of this latest conflict? What you're hearing? Do you see any hope? Do you see anything positive coming out from in terms of the efforts to make some serious change here with regard to Hamas and what's happening on the ground? Yeah.
Well, on the one hand, this conflict, like its antecedents, demonstrated Israel's effective missile defense strategy through Iron Dome and new additions to it, as well as Israel mounted a very impressive response in terms of taking down so many Palestinian Islamic Jihad leaders. But this is not a happy story. It's different from the wars that preceded it in the sense, and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant made this point a few weeks ago, some of you may have read the interview, that, as he put it, the end of single front wars is over. And what we're looking at now, and what we've actually seen over the past 5-6 weeks, is a multi-front conflict from Lebanon, from Gaza, from Syria, all orchestrated by Iran. And meanwhile, Iran is also working to destabilize the remnants of a nucleic state structure in the West Bank. So part of what we see, and obviously the reason why we focus on Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Gaza, is that it's important to have a way to show initiative. Why should Israel and its supporters be in a defensive position from this so-called axis of resistance and not build on the vulnerability of that axis, which is the vast numbers of people who live there who want a different future? Now, moments of fighting are typically a time when these kinds of voices are the most subdued. The protests that I described in Gaza have happened in the interregna between conflicts, and we have not seen an eruption of anti-Hamas expressions during these conflicts. But I think that really it goes to all of this speaks to the need for a proactive strategy, not just a defensive or reactive approach based on a highly militarized foreign policy of how do we neutralize these fighters, the weapons, etc. We're concerned about draining the swamp, we're less interested in the person, we're less interested in the gun than in the person who is holding the gun. What is it that drives him to wage these terrible conflicts, and what can be done to isolate and ostracize the forces that are pushing for total war? So, we just continue doing what we're doing, particularly in those countries that are rocket pads for Iran.
Right. I read something last week that I hadn't read before, and maybe you know more about it, or maybe you've seen it in other similar type situations. Typically the IDF has warned citizens before sending a rocket, right, to whether it be an apartment building where terrorists were living, and they say, you should really evacuate your building because you're not. There's going to be an attack in the next hour or whatnot, right? Either through phone calls or through leaflets or whatever they end up doing. But I read last week that Hamas then issued a warning to those citizens saying that if they listen to the evacuation of the IDF, they will be punished. So they were sort of between a rock and a hard place, right? So if they stay in the building, they're going to die by the rocket. If they leave, Hamas will kill them, essentially, right? Did you hear anything along those lines, or have you? I imagine this is something that has come up before.
Yes, we have heard, and it is part of a larger policy that is also in the expanse of this series of 25 clips covered, of really not only using Gazan civilians as human shields, but actually hoping for civilian carnage, because they see it as somehow an asset in their propaganda war. Now, I think that part of the response to that is obviously to do everything possible to minimize civilian casualties and demonstrate that to the world. And part of it is, of course, to enable Gazans to tell the world about this, and also to signal that they understand what is going on. They are not really being manipulated by Hamas in this respect, and those kinds of actions only widen the wedge or the gap between Hamas on the one hand and the aggrieved Gazan majority on the other.
Have you seen any change in Iran's, dealings with Gaza or the other countries since the United States pulled out of the nuclear treaty? I forget what the name of that is.
Change in Iranian policy toward Gaza.
Yeah.
Right.
In the shipping of, you go.
Sure. Well, first of all, the sanctions did over the years affect Iranian spending on its proxy militias in Gaza, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, in addition to Yemen, such that, for example, in Lebanon, where Hezbollah operates a media city, there are about 100 satellite channels airing blood-curdling, incendiary propaganda all over the Middle East based in Lebanon. A lot of people were laid off because of budget cuts, and that is attributed to Iran feeling the pinch financially. I think that the real important development on this, and which is part of the reason why we also subtitled this into Farsi and made sure that it got a large audience inside Iran, is the protest movement in Iran, which, by the way, the things that these protesters are saying are uncannily similar to the grievances that these Gazans are describing. In fact, we have a clip about a woman who's a professional dancer who was prevented from ever dancing in public by Hamas and expressing her yearning to dance again and teach young people to dance and so on. We wanted to show Iranians that the money that has been taken away from them to go to these foreign adventures didn't go to liberation of Palestine as Iranian propaganda claimed, but rather it was an exportation of the same extremist ideology from which they were suffering. We saw an opportunity to foster a sense of common destiny between Iranians opposed to their regime and the people in these areas of Iranian domination. So we do believe that there's something there, particularly as the protest movement in Iran continues to grow.
Okay, Michael, go ahead.
You've heard what you're hearing from Gaza. What are you hearing from the West Bank, where there's the Palestinian Authority and Hamas have been arguing between themselves for years?
Yes. Well, in our conversation earlier, Michael mentioned that opinion polling indicates that if you held elections in Gaza and the West Bank, Hamas would be doing better in the West Bank than it would do at home. And Fatah, the party that rules in Ramallah, would probably be doing a lot better in Gaza than it's doing at home. The common feature of governance in the Middle East is that people don't like the people who rule them, whatever their ideology happens to be, with some notable exceptions. Obviously, there's also the weakening of the Palestinian Authority, which is an ongoing issue. In some ways, Hamas is more resilient. It has sources of strength and a certain credibility with about 20 or 25% of the public in Gaza that Fatah doesn't necessarily enjoy today. Now, again, that's a minority of the population, but it's a vested minority and it's a substantial number of people. Again, we feel that chipping away at that credibility by exposing the reality of life is part of what needs to be done. We were also keen to make sure that people in the West Bank saw this. Because of Hamas's popularity in the West Bank, that popularity in part is due to the isolation between Gaza and the West Bank, such that a lot of young people in the West Bank don't really know what it's actually like to live in Gaza. But this gives them a taste of it. It gives them a sense of that experience in a very intimate way, and we hope may cause some people to reconsider who they're going to vote for in the next municipal election in Jericho or campus election in Bir Zayt or elsewhere.
Right. Yeah, you may have answered this question, but I'm wondering if the fruits of your work lead to change. What would be the best outcome? I mean, the chances of a constitutional democracy coming out of Gaza, given all your good work, seem unlikely. What would be the best scenario?
Well, the answer...
Could you also repeat the question so that the people
Yes.
online can hear?
The question was, what would be the desired outcome of all of this effort, be it in Gaza or, if I may, elsewhere in the region where we're also working? So by way of context, I've been working in the region for 30 years. I was active in the UAE for the past 15, 20 years, where I've been involved in things like publishing books about Jewish and Israeli history in Arabic for distribution in the UAE, bringing Israelis long before the Abraham Accords to encounter certain strategic elements within the territory as part of an effort by like-minded people to begin to change the cultural fabric to one that would be more in favor of normalization. When I first lived there in 1999, the climate was very different. I used to have lunch with Hamas members who who were living in the lap of luxury in the UAE. I even had lunch with an Al-Qaeda official from Yemen who tried to convert me to Islam. Those people aren't even allowed into the country anymore. And so it took a generation, but the change, if you consider what the cultural fabric was like in 1999 and the situation in 2023, is profound. It really is profound. And so there are opportunities where there is continuity and where there is persistence to actually make tangible improvements in the sort of informational climate of a place over time. And I believe it's possible to do that anywhere. And we're trying to do it in as many places as possible. It's not easy, it's not straightforward. One has to have a lot of friends and a little bit of luck and so on. But we believe that over time, we have the luxury of the fact that the other side in this conflict, if you will, between the so-called axis of resistance and the Abrahamic axis, has a bankrupt value proposition. They offer no constructive agenda to rebuild these societies. And so the more time that goes by, the greater the appetite for an alternative, the greater the receptivity for the kind of message that we're trying to promote. Constitutional democracy may not be the ready answer for these societies. There have been some breakthroughs and encouraging signs in countries that remain autocratic and will likely continue to be so. But with specific respect to Gaza, I think that I'm not alone, and many Israelis share the understanding that building up an internal sort of process of a drive for change is very important. It's a seed that needs to be nurtured. It has sort of manifested through the street demonstrations and elsewhere. And if we, as a community of like-minded persons, sort of invest through effort, through coordination, in building up and fostering alternative leadership, eventually that leadership will have its day.
I think two more questions. Maybe I saw Roma and
have you presented these, or have these been presented, these clips on I-24? Because I never heard this discussion.
Yes.
The question is whether these clips have been presented on I-24, which is an Israeli or an American-run cable news outlet that focuses on news from Israel.
That's right.
How about that?
Yes, indeed. I-24 has aired some of these clips. We make them available they're on YouTube and anyone can use them. In English, in French, in Arabic. We also brought this presentation to the French Parliament about 2 months ago. I went with Laith Al-Omari from the Washington Institute, and we screened this for an audience of MPs, and I-24 French edition covered that event at the National Assembly.
I have another question, and that is, there's a UN Committee on Palestine.
Mm-hmm.
Israel than this committee. Are you doing anything, or is anyone doing anything about, like the U.S. government, eliminating this committee because it's gone way beyond its usefulness, if there ever was any usefulness?
Do you want to?
Can you just summarize the? And then
Sure. So you're asking about the UN Committee on Palestine and presumably other international bodies that focus rather disproportionately on Israel, within the framework of the UN. So obviously the purpose of this project is to promote the voice that is not sanctioned by Hamas to speak on an international platform. Some of the clips, in fact, we purposefully placed the speaker on an imagined background with UN flags of the UN Security Council and so on, in which they're expressing their aspirations. We are a small organization with limited bandwidth. We created the clips so that people would use them. And we are seeing, and certainly we encourage, the use of these clips in various international venues. We tried to sort of pilot that by bringing it to the French Parliament. We think it's a great idea for the people who are positioned to introduce this material at the UN to do so. We believe that college students, and we've sort of attempted to seed a little bit of activity there, because this is an interesting way to air in a non-controversial, non-confrontational way the reality of Gaza to an audience that may not really have all the information and be led in a certain political direction for want of facts. So we're trying to get as many people to use the material as possible.
Okay, just briefly, Maury and then Bob, the last two questions, and I'll do a brief wrap-up after that.
If Gaza was weakened, who's there to fill the void?
So Maury's question is, if Gaza was weakened, who would be there to fill in the void?
If Hamas were weakened, right?
Yeah, Hamas.
Yeah,
and Bob,
My question is, I'm wondering if Israelis are surprised to hear about this as, I think, this audience.
are Israelis as surprised to hear about this as this audience is?
Right. So to both questions, right?
I've given you both. Because,
I'll do both. So briefly, time is short. I mean, essentially, the first question, you touched on the essence of the problem, and it relates to the question that you posed about an alternative or a desired end result. Fostering alternative leadership takes time, and it takes investment of effort. It takes continuity. There is no immediate answer to this problem. We simply believe that this is the beginning of introducing an awareness of the fact that there are opportunities to foster alternative leadership over time. Now, I'm sorry, the second question
Are Israelis as surprised to hear this?
Yes, we translated it, we subtitled everything into Hebrew as well, and it was, of course, covered on Israeli national television. And there was a significant discussion in Israel, both among Israeli Jews and among Arab Israelis, who really liked this content. And I think that to the point about raising awareness, obviously there's a certain cynicism, an understandable cynicism in Israel about the potential for ties of friendship and partnership with elements within Gaza. And I think this sent a positive message on that score, and it also helped, I think, Israelis feel that their efforts to communicate these realities to the world were being joined by Palestinian voices who also wanted the world to know this about Hamas.
That's great. Ofek, yes, our shaliach, yes. Ofek.
I'm Israeli, so I'm the Israeli emissary here. And I have a question just because you mentioned the Israeli arms. So in June 2021, in the Operation Guardians of the Walls, or Shomer Chomot in Hebrew, we saw that there were many Israeli Arabs who live in Israel, who were born in Israel, mostly young people, who did like big protests, violent protests against the Israeli government and against like IDF soldiers and citizens of Israel. Like I was serving at the same time in Gaza, in the IDF, but my family were afraid to walk around my town. I live in Modi'in. They were afraid because they were afraid of Arabs doing stuff.
Yeah.
Those Israeli Arabs, they lived in Israel since they were born. They already experienced, let's say, the good life of being an Israeli, better education, better everything, and they were still against the Israeli government and the Jewish people who live in Israel. And something that a lot of people say in Israel, from both sides of the political map, is that the Israel-Palestinian conflict is about nationalism. Some Palestinians really believe this country is theirs, not regarding like who is controlling them. And what question is that even if we have the people that are against Hamas in Gaza and want to live a better life, do you think the fact they want a better life will, at the end, will cause peace, or just an alternative to take over Israel? Because I don't think the people who live in the UAE that were convinced to do the peace agreement with Israel have the same motive as Palestinian, if it was clear. I think people were scared. They lived a good life and they're still against Israel. And I wonder what is your take on it? On what happened back then and what the future look like?
It's a lot to summarize.
Sure.
I'll just let Joseph respond. That's okay.
Sure. I mean, there's much to be said about the points you're bringing up, but I'll just say, I'll try to say briefly that, first of all, one of the problems in the region is a crisis of leadership, whereby some of the worst elements are the ones that are the best organized and obviously are the most loudly heard, and violence perpetrated by them tends to dominate the discussion and set the tone. And it is the majority who are pragmatic, who are not interested in perpetrating or experiencing violence, who don't have a framework in which to communicate their aspirations, even if those aspirations come across sometimes in opinion polls and so on. So leadership, forward-looking leadership, is very important in those outcomes. Our experience of Gazans is that some of them indeed are anti-Hamas and opposed to the existence of Israel, and look at cooperation with Israel through the prism of pragmatism. They want to rebuild the Gaza Strip. They understand that the only way to do that is through international support, and it's difficult to imagine how that would work without the involvement of Israelis. We also encountered Gazans who were genuinely of the view that Israelis and Palestinians should be friends and that the conflict should end, and they believe in the notion of mutual recognition. So if you want to be a little bit optimistic, and needless to say, we invest our time and energy in validating that optimism, you would say that between the pragmatic and the truly ideologically forward-looking, there is the basis for a coalition that could bring a positive outcome and could bring around people who harbor a rejectionist mentality over time.
Thank you. Just taking the privilege of the last question, less a question, but just a prompt for you to say a few words about the organization that you founded and lead. We've mentioned it, but...
Well, the Center for Peace Communications has been around since 2019. We are a nonprofit organization that is doing this sort of work around the clock, pretty much around the clock, actually, because we have people, most of our staff are overseas in Arab countries, and some are in Europe, and some of us are here. We are committed to rolling back rejectionist ideologies and elevating forward-looking leadership in favor of Arab-Israeli partnership. We do it in a number of different ways, all of which is described on our website, peacecoms.org. And we're always looking for volunteers and other forms of assistance. We welcome people to spread the word also about what we're doing.
So we invite all of you who are here in person, or all of you who are joining us via the live stream, to, if you choose, support the Center for Peace Communication. And we thank you for being here tonight. Again, those in person and those on the live stream. I thank my colleague and friend, Rabbi Jeremy Wiederhorn of TCS, and all of you from TCS for once again partnering on such an interesting and informative and crucial program this evening. Most importantly, Joseph, thank you for helping us hear and see and envision the different future that so many Gazans envision for themselves. And thank you for platforming and elevating liberal voices in a world that doesn't hear them all that often.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Jeremy. Thanks very much.
Good night, everyone.